Animal Farm and 1984. An introduction by Stephen Fry. Some writers become so associated with a particular mode of imagining, describing, and presenting the world that their names are bandied about in ways that would have surprised and almost certainly alarmed them. Every rackety slum or preposterously eccentric character is Dickensian. Every bureaucratic complexity must be Kafkaesque. This fate has surely befallen no writer so completely as George Orwell. I am prepared to bet that not a day passes in which the adjective Orwellian does not appear in some article, blog, or social media post. As with Kafkaesque and Dickensian, it's perfectly possible to use Orwellian without ever having read a single line of the originating author. I'll be honest with you, for spending time reading Orwell aloud provokes honesty. I was shockingly late to him. English literature was supposed to be my subject at university, and I remember one evening in a pub with fellow students playing a forfeit game where we had to come clean about the great books we had never read, and I guiltily confessed to having failed to get round to either 1984 or Animal Farm. I think I was a little afraid of them. The word Orwellian had made me think that, A, I more or less knew what the books were like anyway and didn't need to bother with them, and B, that they would be grim and merciless reads, reeking of political thought, language and messaging, yielding little of the delight and warmth that I looked for in literature. What our hero of those times, Roland Barthes, called la jouissance de la texte, the pleasure of the text. I filled the hole in my reading soon afterwards and discovered how very wrong my fear had been. But I don't think it's a neglect I should be ashamed of. We all of us, if we're honest, are likely to have been put off certain figures in the mighty pantheon, imagining that this illustrious writer, poet, or artist was not for us. I used to look at bookshelves and see names like Dostoevsky, Chekhov, and Flaubert and shudder with apprehension. These were the deep end. I felt safer in the paddling pool. Most of us have needed a good friend or teacher to encourage us to venture out of the shallows into new experiences in reading. One of the reasons I value audiobooks as a listener as much as an occasional reader is that so many of the difficulties of a text on the page disappear when a book is read aloud. Maybe that is why you have come to these audiobook versions of Orwell's two masterpieces. Or maybe you are here to refamiliarize yourself with old friends. The fact is, as I hope you will find, Orwell is extraordinarily approachable. The use of language to confuse, to confound, to deceive and to conceal is one of his great subjects, and while he did not lay down absolute rules of style, he was very sure that writing should be clear, simple, and unencumbered of ornament and complexity. After all, as you will discover in both Animal Farm and 1984, the manipulation and distortion of language emerges as the primary tool of tyranny. Whatever your political allegiances, I'm sure you'll agree that the use of such manipulation and distortion to control the populace is no less urgent an issue in our time than it was in his. The life and career of George Orwell, a pseudonym, his birth name was Eric Blair, seems to present a mass of contradictions. He is well known for plunging, literally, into life as a washer-up in deluxe Parisian restaurants and sharing life with the working class in the horrific slums of the industrial north. He recorded all this in two early works, Down and Out in London and Paris and The Road to Wigan Pier. Yet he was an old Etonian with imperial and aristocratic plantation slavers' blood in his veins, who served the British Empire as a colonial policeman in Burma. One of the reasons his reputation remains so high is that in reading him one can follow how, despite this background, he came to learn, change, and develop the worldview he did. His searing honesty with himself and his deep sense of social justice led him to question colonialism and unfettered capitalism, but having initially warmed to the idea of Marxism, his experience fighting against Franco's fascists in the Spanish Civil War, where he contracted the tuberculosis that was to kill him 12 years later, also gave him first-hand evidence of the lies, cruelty, and ruthless suppression of free thinking employed by the Soviets, who funded much of the anti-Franco cause. Orwell was filled with especial impatience and disgust at the rose-tinted delusion of many of his left-wing intellectual friends, Lenin's useful idiots, who, in his view, willfully overlooked, denied, or forgave the Soviet Union's injustices, deceit, and fraud. All this came out in his 1938 book, Homage to Catalonia, in which the lies and barbarity of Russian behavior were clearly delineated. The book sold less than 700 copies, and, partly inspired by the success of Arthur Koestler's intense novel of Soviet interrogation and forced confession, Darkness at Noon, and by Aldous Huxley's vision of a technological future in Brave New World, Orwell came to the conclusion that political journalistic writing could not tell the truth with anything like the power, precision, and punch of literary fiction. Thus, he conceived the fable Animal Farm. Using the allegory of a Sussex smallholding, he could expose the betrayals, barbarities, and distortions of Stalin, his purges, show trials, and brutal secret police. But at just the time Orwell was formulating this story, in the early 1940s, the Soviet Union was hurling herself against the might of Hitler's Wehrmacht in the most attritional act of sacrificial homeland defense the world had ever seen. And by doing so, she was turning the tide of the entire war and allowing Britain and her allies some kind of cover in which to prepare for D-Day and the invasion of France. Without Stalin and his totalitarian grip on the vast millions of citizens he controlled there is no chance the Nazi threat could ever have been overcome. Many of Orwell's friends, much as they might have agreed with him about the failures and disappointments of communism, thought that for him to attack the Soviet Union at this time was folly or worse. It is not altogether surprising that Orwell found it hard to get his novella published. The manuscript was turned down everywhere, famously by no less a figure than the poet T.S. Eliot. It was not until after victory in Europe, when the West's warm alliance with the Soviet Union began quickly to chill to Cold War, that Animal Farm finally found a publisher. 7 or 8 years later, the Americans were dropping copies behind the Iron Curtain from balloons, with an irony that one can only feel would have simultaneously amused and dismayed Orwell. There are educational boards in the US today that ban or censor the book because of its convincing criticism of Mr. Jones and the rousing call to rebellion made by Old Major in the opening chapter. The book, and all references to it, are banned in China too. Extremes of left and right are united in their disapproval. Orwell subtitled Animal Farm a fairy story, as if ironically to distance himself from its unmissable allegory. To have called it a fable, which is what it is, might have looked too on the nose, as we say now. You don't have to know much history to see Stalin in Napoleon, Trotsky in Snowball, Hitler in Farmer Frederick, and a blend of Marx and Lenin in Old Major. Squealer might be Molotov. The Battle of the Windmill could be thought of as the Siege of Leningrad, and Boxer, the tirelessly loyal coal miner Alexei Stakhanov. Moses the Raven seems to be a mixture of Rasputin and the Orthodox Church itself. One can certainly go through the book congratulating oneself on finding lots of historical correspondences, but it absolutely isn't necessary. The beautifully consistent presentation of real farm and animal life allow the story to work without having to map it all against real-life episodes and characters. The language is simple, the sentences short, the directness and force of the story irresistible. Indeed, such is the power of narrative art that I think we can safely say that Animal Farm will be read and valued long after the details of the Russian Revolution and its participants have become the province of the specialist historian. Just as we can read Gulliver's Travels without having to know that the Lilliputian character of Flimnap, for example, is supposed to represent Robert Walpole. As the old Latin tag has it, vita brevis, ars longa. Life is short, but art is long. 1984 was written 5 or 6 years after Animal Farm and published in 1949, when Orwell's health was already wrecked by the tuberculosis that would kill him early the following year. Some believe the title comes from the inversion of the year in which he completed the book, 1948. Having looked at how dictatorship had arisen in Russia, he now showed how it could spread over the whole world, and how technology, fear, suppression, denouncement, networks of informants, and all the techniques of propaganda and surveillance might result in a dark and monstrous world order that could never be defeated or overturned. His vision remains the absolute archetype of a certain kind of bleak futurescape, a reverse utopia. Much of its language has entered ours. Big Brother, Room 101, Newspeak, Doublethink, Hate Week, Thought Crime, Memory Hole, Prole, Unperson. The modern reader might find the unremittingly joyless, colourless texture of daily life in 1984 more shocking than its tyrannical politics. Our hero Winston Smith's body seems to be a symbol of the body politic. He is beset by sores, a sour and miserable digestion. Count how many times his guts, intestines, innards, etc. are referenced. Fed by foul, oily gin, rank tobacco, and a disgusting diet. Orwell's near-contemporary Aldous Huxley had written his dystopian novel, Brave New World, over a decade earlier, and many might think Huxley's presentation of a future where the populace are kept happy with drugs, sex, and entertainment is more convincing than Orwell's. The writers exchanged letters on just that subject. Surely 1984 gets it all wrong, you might think. Orwell underestimated the ability of capitalism to control the world through consumerism and popular culture. He did not foresee the rise of multinational corporations more powerful than states and governments. You might justifiably come to that conclusion as you listen to the novel unfold. Part of what you feel will be relief. Thank goodness it didn't turn out like that. We have greater choice now. Our lives are filled with colour, richness, the bounty of all 5 continents heaped up in vast hypermarkets, all knowledge and experience available at a touch of a screen, democracy still alive and, well, alive. The future that O'Brien describes to Winston Smith, a boot stamping on a human face forever, that looks most unlikely. But are we free from the distortions of language, the annulment of human reputation and effacement from history? Are we free from hate weeks, the surveillance state, technological control, and the sacrifice of privacy? Maybe the very act of writing the novel altered our destiny. Sometimes by prophesying the future, you change it. If you warn of a danger, people might avoid it, and then damn you for your needless pessimism. Reading 1984 again brings too a deep admiration for Orwell's brilliance as a writer, the clarity and readability of his prose, those rare touches of colour, Winston's memories of food and flowers, and above all the mysterious beauty of the cheap paperweight he finds in the antique shop. Like wildflowers pushing up through the rubble of a bomb site, they seem to shine through and belie the pessimism and horror of his vision. Happy listening.